Well, welcome again to the fourth in a series of 4 programs on the sound of Japanese music. I'm Brenda Jordan with the Pitt NCTA, and we want to express our thanks to the University of Pittsburgh National Consortium for Teaching About Asia and the Japan America Society of Pennsylvania for co-sponsoring this program. Tonight, in our final presentation, we're very fortunate to have Benjamin Pachter, who is the executive director of the Japan America Society of Central Ohio, which is a nonprofit based in Dublin, Ohio, dedicated to fostering the relationship between Central Ohio's Japanese and American communities. He received his PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Pittsburgh in 2013, where he wrote his dissertation on the musical history of contemporary Taiko performance in Japan and the United States. Ben is also a performer of Taiko. He is currently the assistant director of Dublin Taiko, the largest K-12 Taiko organization in North America, and is a member of the board of directors of the Taiko Community Alliance. And his presentation tonight will be on Taiko, of course, but he also has 2 essays that supplement this, which you will find on our Japan Pitt website. So with no further ado, Ben, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited by the opportunity to kind of share some elements about Taiko with you this evening and kind of round out and finish off what has been an amazing series of presentations. I just hope I can live up to the standards that have been placed before me. One quick element before we begin. Unfortunately, there's going to be no live Taiko presentations this evening. Due partially in the fact that Zoom and Taiko do not mix well. Just the formatting that allows for wonderful voice communications and interactions via Zoom actually don't necessarily work very well with Taiko without some major finagling and multiple microphones, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, I think we've come up with a very interesting solution that will be exciting, kind of allow us to take advantage of the medium to try some different things. So without further ado, we are going to go ahead and get started, move into the presentation. We will be doing a Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions that come up in the meanwhile, please feel free to chat it, put it in the chat, and I will answer them as best as I can. So with that, let us begin. So at this point, everybody should be seeing my screen that says the title of this paper, which is Taiko Tradition as a Basis for Innovation. One element about this presentation that I would like to make at this time is we're not necessarily going to be talking about a matter of how Taiko used to be used versus how they are used today. Because it's very difficult to talk about Taiko in such contexts, particularly as a lot of the performance traditions that we're going to be talking about that have a very long history to them still all exist simultaneously. So it's a very much a growing and multiple usages and constantly weaving and interacting and changing. The idea of tradition itself is, of course, not necessarily a static object, but something that has a lot of history and movement and innovation and different changes to it. So this title itself actually comes from a poster that is, or was at one point in time, hanging in the Taiko Center of Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is where I did a lot of my Taiko training. It's a favorite phrase of a professional Taiko performer named Kenny Endo. Kenny is the first non-Japanese national to have received a natori, or a stage name or performance name, in Hogaku Hayashi, which is classical drumming. And he did so after studying in Japan for about 10 years during the 1980s. And this is a phrase that he has adopted that came from something his teachers were saying. And his teachers themselves were ones who were trained in multiple mediums, who were professional taiko performers in kabuki and no theaters, but also had their backgrounds in festival drumming and had played in cabarets and store openings in many different locations. And this really informs how Kenny and how I like to think about Taiko as well. It's not a matter of one style or genre replacing another, but rather it's kind of a continued evolution with things blending and influencing each other, resulting in a broader overall holistic approach to how Taiko are being used, because all these things are still happening today. So I'm hoping that with today's presentation, you'll get a little bit of a sense of that, but particularly in the context of one particular performance medium that I both perform and have studied as well. But before we kind of get into how Taiko are used, I want to talk first about the history of Taiko a little bit, because drums are believed to be the first instrument ever outside of the voice. You hit something, it makes a noise, that becomes an instrument. It's a very simplistic way of looking at drums, but that is the reality. Drums have a very long history in Japan as well. Last week, Yuko talked about the myth of Amino Uzume, who had danced on top of a barrel to lure or draw out Amaterasu from her cave. And there's one line of thought or one mythology or one belief system that this was the first drum. We had a god dancing on a large barrel and making a noise with those rhythms, and that was kind of the mythological origins for the Taiko. With that also came an association of Taiko as being instruments that can speak to the gods. If you go to a shrine or temple, for example, one of the few instruments that is used in ritualistic practices in Buddhism or Shintoism and so forth is a Taiko. They're believed to be sacred objects, so there's a lot of belief systems involved with it, and it can all be drawn back to the Amaterasu myth. Physically speaking, we can see physical evidence of Taiko dating back to the 6th or 7th century Japan. This is when in the top right-hand corner, we have these Haniwa terracotta figures that were made during the Kofun period of Japan. Some of the earliest figures that that have been discovered are of drummers. So there is physical evidence dating back to this period of people playing drums. It's believed that a lot of instruments made their way over to Japan from China around the same time. Yuko mentioned, talked a little bit last week about the beginning of Gagaku and such, and that's actually been talked about in a few different presentations to this point. It's believed that the first ancestors of modern Taiko were brought over by Japanese men who were studying to Korea to study how to play the kakko, which is the modern name for an instrument, a type of drum that is used in the Chinese court music that made its way into Japan, is now known as gagaku. Also, it's worth noting, even though its relevance in the discussion from a musical perspective is very little, Taiko were used as ritualistic, or not as ritualistic, as communication devices during wars. So they're very effective of being heard over long distances. So there is a militaristic association, but that has no bearing on the drums themselves, the music they play, anything such as that. You're not playing war music whenever you're playing Taiko in any way, shape, or form. So what are Taiko? Taiko is a Japanese word that means drum. And under that element, there's plenty of different types of Taiko. If we're being more specific, what I am going to be discussing is waraiko, Japanese drums. I'm going to be talking about more specifically some of the more commonly used drums today across multiple genres. This is a picture in the background here of the showroom of the Asano Taiko US store in Torrance, California. This is the first Taiko store in the United States, created by Asano Taiko, which is one of the oldest drum makers in Japan. And you go in there, it's just a wonderland of drums. But they have a few types that they focus upon. And I'm gonna highlight 2 of them today. Partially because that's what is most commonly used, again, cross genres. the first type of drum that we are going to talk about is called a byouchi daiko, which means a tacked drum. Called as such because the head is attached to the body by tacks. And you'll notice on the left-hand side picture here, we actually have a picture of the inside of a drum. Notice it's cracking a little bit around between 1 and 2 o'clock, and between 7 and 8, 8 and 9 o'clock. This originally was a solid body carved drum. These things are carved out of solid bodies. And one of the kind of fun things that we thought we'd do to take advantage of this medium is I am actually going to be switching cameras. So very quick, I'm actually going to be switching to a different camera. So we're talking about the construction of the drum itself. It is historically a solid body, although this is actually made out of multiple slats of wood that has been very carefully painted where you actually cannot see the individual slats. This makes it lighter and cheaper, but it actually changes the sound. We have a cow skin that is nailed onto the head using brass tacks. These holes here, which are called mimi or ears, are where they actually cut slits in to put little dowel rods upon which they then hung ropes. They would tighten these ropes, twist these ropes to tighten the head, get it further and further down. And once they got it as tight as they wanted, it was only at that time that they would have the brass tacks on. Some drum makers actually cut this off entirely, but it makes it harder to reskin it after the fact. Go over to the side, something I want to notice here. This is something that's called the con. This has more of a historical usage where this is something that they would use to carry the drum on horseback, or maybe as part of a ritual, bringing the drum around for a festival usage. It has no real purpose nowadays, but different drum makers have different types of con. So more than anything else, it has a just a visual element to it, but also it makes it recognize, allows you to recognize where the drum is from. There I am again, hello. This drum is from the Taiko Center of Kyoto, which is a manufacturer obviously based out of Kyoto. And it's my own personal drum that I actually do not get to play as much as I would like. So switching back over, go. And I can't play a drum obviously here, but we've created some videos that allow you to actually kind of hear what a drum has. Sounds like if you have never seen a taiko in person. Pretty straightforward. It's the drum. And the larger the drum, the deeper the sound. This is actually, it's not a small drum per se, but because of the construction of the drum, it actually has very high overtones, so it does not sound as deep as, say, a solid body drum would if I was playing on it. One thing that I do want to note is about often it's asked how you learn how to play this instrument, or any instruments. Traditionally, taiko is an orally transmitted music performance style where music is not written down. Instead, you use something which is called kuchi shoga, which can mean mouth song or mouth poem, where a syllable will represent the sound that you are hearing. So for example, that which you just heard, a loud hit in the center of the drum, is a don. So on a proper Japanese taiko, solid body, larger drum, it sounds like don. Versus if we hit on the rim, that is ka. So using just those two syllables, you can say a phrase of music like don, don, ka, ka, don, kara, ka, ka, don, doko, don, kara, don, don, don. If you have an understanding of what the syllables mean, you could play what I just said. And this is how taiko music is orally transmitted. A lot of Japanese instruments are actually orally transmitted in this way as well, where there is a kuchi shoga, there's a syllable to represent a sound. This has nothing to do with rhythm, except for don and doko, there's some components to it. Doesn't tell you how to hit the drum, it's just telling you this is a loud hit or a soft hit or hit on the rim or so forth. And different drums sometimes can have different kuchishoga. We're going to get into that in just a second. So we have also, in addition to Byoichi Daiko, we have Shime Daiko, which is a tightened drum. This is a drum in which head is placed on either side of the body, and that head itself is stretched across a ring, now a ironing ring nowadays. And holes are inside the ring, and it is tightened using ropes that are laced through it and then pulled tighter and tighter and tighter to create a higher sound. In modern era, you also see a bolt system that uses bolts instead of ropes. And to that end, I'm actually going to show that as well, because that is the drum that I have with me. So you will see that I have my Nagano Daiko, my Chu Daiko, my Byoichi Daiko on the right, and I have my Shime Daiko on the left. So if we zoom in on the Shime Daiko, you will see that it's a system of bolts connected and screws or nuts that are connected to a ring in the center. And it's by tightening these individual nuts and bolts that the head becomes tighter. This is a lot easier than the rope system, but it actually results in a lot heavier drum. I actually prefer the rope system myself because it takes a little more work, but to tighten it, but it's also a lot easier to loosen it, and it makes a lot lighter drum. And you'll notice you can actually see lacing here on the head, which is how it is attached to the ring, and how, because it's folded over a ring and then laced together. You notice this thing is, you can see the center of the head is a little above the rim of the head, because this thing has been tightened so much to get to a certain tension of the drum. Before we get into how the drum sounds for a second, just want to take a second and highlight what we use to hit the drums, and that is bachi. These are just some of the bachi that I carry with me to practice every week, or whenever we used to have practices every week. And long story short, the size of the bachi is determined by the size of the drum. Larger the drum, the larger the bachi. These two smaller ones I have over here on the left-hand side are very light bachi, very soft wood that are used for playing Shime Daiko. This one in the middle here is medium-sized, heavier wood, stronger wood that I use for Nagano Daiko, for Chu Daiko, for Byoichi Daiko. Then right-hand side here, I have my large O-Daiko bachi for the large O-Daiko, the largest drums. But they're actually lighter than my Chu Daiko bachi because they're made of very, very, very soft wood. But nevertheless, the larger the drum, the larger the bachi. So 1 second, I'm going to place this down. While you look at that, as I'm switching back over, I'm going to take a moment because there was a question, is the Shime Daiko tunable to a particular pitch? The answer is yes, you could. Most people do not. Simply because it's not really necessary, although there are some solo taiko performers who do focus a little more on that. What kind of changes happen whenever you loosen or tighten the Shime Daiko? The tighter the drum, the higher pitch the sound. What kind of drum is used for the bachi and for the drum? Nowadays, in terms of Chu Daiko, the Byoichi Daiko, Zelkovia wood is most commonly used by taiko manufacturers as traditional hinoki, or various different types of Japanese wood that has become very difficult to use. Zelkovia is more often nowadays. In terms of the bachi, it's a lot more varied. All my light bachi are made out of hole, which is white cypress, I believe. It's a Japanese wood type. While my heavier bachi are made out of oak or hinoki, which is also another Japanese type of Japanese wood. So thank you very much for the questions, and apologies for the sound difference. We had tested something before and it obviously stopped working. So with that, we are going to go back to the presentation. So if I'm sharing my screen once again, and we switch over. So we had a Shimidaiko. So I played, this is a quick video of me playing the drum you just saw. Higher pitched drum. There are drums, if I was really cranking it, really taking the time, I could get it quite high, quite distance higher than it is. The Kuchi Shoga for that sound is 10. So what I just hit was 10, 10. There's also tsukus and sus, and it's basically there's a Kuchi Shoga for a loud hit, there's a Kuchi Shoga for a soft hit, and there's a Kuchi Shoga for no hit at all. To give an example of that, I wanted to show a brief piece of music. Because as I said earlier, taiko music is historically orally transmitted, but there are some performance genres in which it is written down. And this, for example, is from a very stylized, very focused example of festival music. So this actually comes from Edobayashi, which is a type of festival music from Tokyo. This actually has all of the, this has a chudaiko, a shimidaiko, and also a handheld gong and a tarigane. So if I can annotate this. So this portion right here is the shimidaiko. So the middle portion is the shimidaiko. So we have 10, 10, 2, iya, tere, teke, 10, 2, iya. That's indicating 10. So it's hits. If it's on the right side of the column, it's played with the right hand. If it's on the left side of the column, it's played with the left hand. Tsu, the tiny tsu is actually a rest. Iya is a kakegoi. It's a something you kind of just think rather than say. In this instance, even though we would call it a kakegoi because it is a connecting voice, it is a syllable that has a rhythmic purpose within it. Directly to the right of that section would be the small, sorry, trying to think how to best describe it, my apologies. The filled in circle immediately to the right of that, which is actually part of the previous column, is for the chudaiko. So that's actually the left column of the side. The right column immediately to the right of the shimidaiko, and I'm actually having a hard time seeing my my mouse at the moment, or else I would annotate even further, is for the tarigane. You can see over towards the middle of the sheet, there's one with a small filled-in circle, and a large filled-in circle, and two large filled-in circles, and two small filled-in circles. That is the tarigane, the handheld gong, indicating between a muted and unmuted tone. So with this, each line represents a beat, so you can figure out what the rhythm is, where you're hitting on the drum, or what sound you're supposed to be making, and with what hand. And this sort of notation is used to pass on certain types of music. So I can end my annotation really quick. And we're going to move on. So that is a little brief oversight of how taiko are used. What taiko are used. So now we're going to talk about the how are they going to be used. These two taiko families, that is shimidaiko and byoichi daiko, are used across genres. You may have different variations of it existing in different portions, but they nevertheless are used pretty much across genre. And while it's an oversimplification, most music in Japan could probably be classified within one of 5 categories. That is court music, religious music, folk music, theatrical music, or popular music. And we're going to briefly cover these 5 categories. Taiko are used in all of these categories. Taiko are used in all Japanese music. The type of taiko that may be used in a particular genre may be different. How it may be used may be different, but nevertheless, taiko will be present. And there's often overlap between the two. For example, there's blurred lines between folk and religious, or religious and theater, or cult and religious, folk and theater. And these could all be popular as well, depending on the context. So it really just depends. This is also why I'm not using a modern versus traditional divide, because a lot of musics I'm going to be talking about are very old, but are still performed today regularly. So it's a little hard to really talk about what's going on. Question was asked, I mentioned use of different hands. What does the different use of hand make in striking of the drum? If you are playing correctly, it should make no difference whatsoever. There should be no difference in sound between your right hand and left hand. There are some performers who do say that there is a difference, but different kuchi shoga may be used between your right hand and your left hand for mnemonic purposes more than an actual sound purpose. So if I'm striving to have as great a sound as I could, my right hand and my left hand should not make any difference in terms of how they are sounding. That's a very good question. Thank you very much for that. So with that, let's take a look at how taiko are used. First type we're going to talk about is court music, gagaku. If you've been in some of the lectures to this point previously, we have talked about gagaku a little bit. Just as a reminder, this is probably the oldest of Japanese musical performance arts. It was introduced to Japan from China in the 6th century. This was Tang Dynasty era court music that was brought from China to Japan, and then they're kind of separated. Gagaku after that point started to incorporate music from India, music from Korea, music from Manchuria. So gagaku as it exists is slightly different than the actual Tang Dynasty music as it was brought over in the 5th and 6th centuries. A gagaku ensemble is comprised of wind, string, and percussion instruments. The most commonly used instruments are the hikiriki, which is the thing back and to the left. Then we have the sho, which is the organ pipe looking things, is maybe the best way to describe them. We also have a biwa that is seen here. And then we have taiko. Then on the left-hand side, the drum that is within an ornate stand is called a tsuri daiko. It is hit with 2 mallets on one side of the drum, and you sit behind the drum, so you typically do not see the player. On the right-hand side, we have a kakko. This is the drum that historically were one of the first things people went from Japan to Korea to learn. A question came in about stance while playing taiko. Does the stance differ for the different taiko? Also, is the position of the arms, etc., prescribed as we learned it can be for shamisen? That is a very complex question because there's no one right way to play taiko. There's certain stylistic things that have creeped in. So if you stand between, and even if I take a nagoro daiko, there may be different types of stands. So a lot of time the stand itself dictates the taiko, but also the style of drumming that you're playing and the piece that you were playing may dictate the taiko. As you get into more stylized things such as gagaku, for example, or some of the theatrical music that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that is a little more prescribed. That is, you sit in this fashion, you hold your body this fashion, you hit in this fashion. But as you get a little more modern and a little more elements of folk, those restrictions break down to a certain point. And I'm actually going to be highlighting a little bit of those later. So very good question. We're going to be talking about it in a second. We've played gagaku music before in some of the previous lectures, but I just want to give people a brief glimpse. If you've not heard gagaku before, just want to have a brief clip of Eichanraku, which is one of the most famous gagaku pieces. hard to play gagaku in a lecture because gagaku develops very slowly. These are long pieces in a Johaku compositional style that, again, it's a very slow build. And so it's kind of hard to play the beginning of a piece or even where at any point you pick within the piece and kind of really show what it is. But nevertheless, allowed you to hear the gagaku with the, the kako within the gagaku, which is two heads that are tightly strung around a cylindrical body and hit with two mallets. In the gagaku performance, I believe the mallets actually have small ball-like ends to them, which is not something you see in other performance types. But this is really the origin point of all taiko performance. Again, we're dating back to the 5th and 6th century at this point. And that is in the realms of court music. And this music is still performed today. It is still performed in the imperial court. There are imperial court musicians whose job and responsibility is to keep on tradition of gagaku and perform it and demonstrate it around the world as well as perform it in the imperial court or the imperial household at this point. So that is court music. We also have religious usages. And again, there's many different types. Here, one thing that I want to focus on, because it's particularly relevant to some of the other discussions we have later on, is kagura. And this is Shinto ritual dance that is accompanied by an ensemble comprised of two drums and a melodic instrument, typically a bamboo flute. This kagura is called a sato kagura. We're going to mention a little bit more. But these Shinto ritualistic ceremonial dances actually have costumes that are a little more in line with court music, so gagaku. That is gagaku that has a dance. If we're getting really detailed in it, there's gagaku that's just music, and there's gagaku that's actually accompanying dance. And a lot of times, many of the costumes in kagura are similar to the gagaku dance costumes. But the music in kagura, it often has more in line with folk music. So again, this is this hybrid entity where we have the musicians dressed very similar to court musicians, but the music they're playing is not necessarily court music. So just take a listen to that very quickly. So it's a god or somebody who's serving. I'll actually show what see on the right-hand side of the orchestra, or the ensemble, I'm sorry, there was two drummers and a flutist. Drummer was playing an instrument very similar to a kakko. The one in the front, the one in the rear was playing a byoichi daiko, a small byoichi daiko. It was probably called an o-daiko because it was larger than the other drums. The music they're playing is very similar to festival music, but what they're wearing is very similar to gagaku. The question has been asked that traditional musics have not been taught or played typically in schools, nor is there school clubs for shamisen and koto. Is that the same with taiko, or is taiko played or taught in schools? There are indeed taiko school clubs, and taiko is part of the instruments that received a push beginning this century to be better represented in the music education in the schools, but it is still greatly in the minority. But for reasons that I hope we'll be able to get to later on, there are a lot more wadaiko-bu. There are taiko clubs, much more than there may be a shamisen club or a koto club. I'm not going to say that every high school or middle school has a wadaiko-bu, but there are quite a lot across Japan. But the music they're playing is not any of the music we've talked about so far. And we'll get to that type of music in a little bit. Type 3. We've been talking about gagaku or court music. We've been talking about kagura. We're talking about religious music. Then we have theatrical music, hogaku. This is classical music. The term hogaku is often used for classical Japanese music, but if we're getting into it more detailed, is typically referring to theatrical music, the music of No, the music of Kabuki, the music of Bunraku. And the basis of the ensemble is drums and some sort of melodic instrument. This is a no gaku, this is a no ensemble comprised of a tsuzumi, two types of tsuzumi, which are hourglass drums that are rope tightened with skins on each side. The old tsuzumi is held at the hip of the player, while the kotsuzumi is over the shoulder. Then we have another shimeraiko, and we have in this instance a bamboo flute called a nokan. This is the core of most ensembles. This is a no ensemble. In Kabuki, the nokan may be replaced by, as Yuko said last week, the shamisen. So let's listen to a little bit of what theatrical music sounds like. So that is an example of music that accompanies a dance, the hanomai, in No theater. One thing that is worth noting is that the vocal gestures they are making is part of the music. It is called kakegoe, or connecting voice. It is used to help keep the ensemble in time, is used to signal changes in tempo, strength, volume. So it is part of the music. You must learn it as alongside everything else. You also may notice that the otsuzumi, the larger drum that is held at the hip of the performer, actually has a higher pitch than the kotsuzumi. So it's one of those interesting instances where smaller does not necessarily mean higher. Again, all of these are very different performance types, but they all coexist. We have Hogaku Hayashi, Nogaku Bayashi, performed same time that we have Kagura being performed. Sometimes you actually may find both at the same festival, and may even find some Gagaku as well, depending on where you are and the history of that particular festival. So speaking of festival, we get to probably what is the most commonly found musical uses of taiko, and that is the easiest for you to see if you go to Japan. That is folk music, more specifically festival music. One of the primary uses of taiko is in a festival ensemble called a matsuri bayashi. The term matsuri bayashi means festival orchestra, but it's also sometimes used to refer to the music itself. But more often than not, the music actually has a more specific name that refers to the place where it's from. For example, we have Edo Bayashi, which is the music of Edo, the old name for Tokyo, or Kanda Bayashi, which is specific to the Kanda area of old Edo or Tokyo, or Kamitsuki Mikoshi Daiko, which is the Mikoshi drumming of Kamitsuki area of Miyake Island. So these all kind of fall under the overall umbrella of Matsuri Bayashi. So let's listen to some Matsuri Bayashi.
Oh, we can't hear you, Ben. Sorry, I think we couldn't hear you at the moment.
Sorry, I turned off my mic to be able to take a drink of water and then forgot to turn it back on.
Don't worry.
This is very repetitive music because it is meant to accompany a the procession of a mikoshi, or a portable shrine, as it enters or leaves the shrine grounds, or it's moving away to the area where it is taking the resident god of a Shinto shrine to bless the region surrounding, or to go from a main shrine to a portable shrine. The point of the music is to announce the presence of or approach of the gods. There's also a supplemental area to maybe help spur on those people who are carrying the mikoshi, because mikoshi are very, very heavy. You may notice in that previous video, or 20 or 30 people carrying one mikoshi. Matsuribayashi is very similar to the other ensembles we've seen performed, a combination of melodic instruments and taiko. In this instance, we have two shime-daiko, another byoichi daiko, we have a handheld gong, the atarigane, and then a bamboo flute that is called a shino-bue, because it's made out of a particular type of bamboo called shino. The question comes in, and you can see it in this picture right here. Are there both male and female taiko performers? This is a yes, but question, where it depends on the genre of music. It is very rare to find them in theatrical music, because although it's becoming more common, and nearly non-existent for female performers to be in court music. Festival music is a lot more common than it used to be. This has to do in part to purification beliefs and beliefs about cleanliness amongst the female body, and beliefs of the females were inherently unclean because they menstruated, et cetera, et cetera. And as taiko were believed to be holy instruments, a woman could not play them because the act of doing so would sully the instrument. That belief system is not in place as much anymore, but that origin is still impacting who often plays this music. Although again, in Hogaku, you are seeing more and more female performers, but it is still rare. But Matsuribayashi, yeah, you'll find a mixture with no issue. So these are older usages of it. And then we have quote unquote popular music. Things like, you may be familiar with Taiko no Tatsujin or Taiko Master, the Taiko arcade game. I have in the corner over here, Taiko-kun, who is the mascot for Taiko no Tatsujin. There's now Taiko no Tatsujin is actually available around the world on Nintendo Switch. I own it myself. In the right-hand corner, we have a band called the Wagaki Band, or the Japanese instrument band. It is a rock ensemble that uses traditional Japanese instruments like the shamisen, the koto, the shakuhachi, the nokan, the shino-bue, and taiko. And we have regular collaborations with Hatsune Miku, the computer-based idol, who within recent years has been collaborating with a taiko group named Kodo. So you are seeing taiko emerging within, say, the last 20 years or so. No, say last 35 years at this point, in popular music styles. That is music for popular entertainment. Not to say that Hogaku is not for popular entertainment, because kabuki is a theater of the matches compared to No, of course. But the music itself is not necessarily something you just listen to for your own edification. However, these three usages all have one common point of confluence, and that is they are based on the major proliferation of taiko performance since the 1980s, but it's a very particular type of taiko performance, and I'm actually going to be spending the rest of the time before question and answer talking about that particular type of taiko performance. It's a genre that it's very difficult to describe what it is. In my dissertation, which you can find on the PIT website, I use the term wadaiko. I actually don't use that anymore because it's complicated. What I just use now is it's contemporary taiko performance. It's modern taiko performance. What this means specifically, it's a performance style in which drums are at the center of performance. There is a note that there are a couple taiko performers who play contemporary taiko performance in the audience today. including Aaron Kelly, who's one of the co-founders with me of Pittsburgh Taiko, and Rob Reams and Jake from Pittsburgh Taiko. So what Pittsburgh Taiko plays and what I perform is contemporary Taiko performance. This is Taiko, where Taiko is the main element of performance. Every other performance we've been watching to this point, Taiko is part of a large ensemble. Taiko is not the focus of performance in and of itself. Beginning in the 1950s, however, you started to see a motion where that started to change, where the performance of Taiko itself was the purpose of a performance. It was not accompanying anything, it was just drumming. And that can largely be drawn to a single group. So now we're going to get into some group names and such to this point. And there's a group called Osuwa Daiko. Osuwa Daiko was founded by a man named Oguchi Daihachi, last name first, so Oguchi is his family name. He's the man in the middle there. This is an older picture, so it's a little pixelated. He's passed away, unfortunately. But Oguchi Daihachi was a drummer who did not grow up in any traditions we've talked about before. He never learned Japanese drumming. He was a jazz drummer. He was actually a war prisoner during World War II, held in one of prisoner camps in China. After he came back to Japan after World War II, he started playing in popular music ensembles, like Hawaiian music ensembles and so forth. But one day he was asked to perform a fragment of music that was found in a miso cellar of a relative's miso house. You can actually see that in the bottom right-hand corner. He was asked to perform this for a local festival that they were reviving again after World War II. The problem was he didn't know how to play this music. He had never taught it. He had never played it in his life, but he liked the idea of reviving this festival for the community. So he learned how to play it. He found somebody who actually learned from the person who wrote down this music around the turn of 20th century and learned how to play it. He found that those large notes were loud hits by the right hand. The small circles were small, like quieter hits by the left, on the left hand. Again, a large hit was large circle, loud right hand, filled in dots were on the rim. He learned this, he learned how to play it. But then he found he didn't like how it sounded. So instead of playing something at the festival that he didn't like how it sounded, he actually decided to arrange it for an ensemble. It was originally supposed to be played by two players, one on each side of a drum. He changed it so it was played by a bunch of players playing many drums. And the result was a piece called Suwa Ikazuchi, or Suwa Thunder. So let's listen to a brief clip of this. What does this have in common with the music that they found, which actually was later determined to be Kagura drumming? Very, 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 very little. Nothing that you are seeing on stage is traditional. The drums are old. The drums have historically been used for many, many years. The costumes are not traditional. The ways of hitting the drum have some origins in festival music drumming, but they've been changed a little bit to accentuate the fact that this is being performed on stage, not as part of a festival ensemble. There's a lot of movement around the drums and visual components and yelling that, again, looks good. And it makes for a good theatrical performance, but has very little to do with the origins of the piece itself. But the historicity and the traditional nature of this drumming aside, this became popular very, very quickly. Thanks in part to Oguchi being very savvy in terms of promoting himself and promoting the ensemble. Osuwa Daiko comes from the name of the Suwa Grand Shrine, the Suwa Taisha, where they gave their first performance, the O and Osuwa. So if I go back one, you will see the O and Osuwa for Osuwa Daiko on the bottom part, for those who can read Japanese, is a very high-end honorific for Osuwa Daiko. So they connected themselves with the Suwa Grand Shrine. They started performing at festivals across first central Japan and then other parts of Japan. They appeared on NHK. They eventually participated in the opening ceremonies of the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. So within the span of about 10 years, where this group first debuted in, say, 55, 56, they very quickly made their name known as playing a new style of taiko performance that didn't have much in common with what came before. It had a rhythmic sense that had more in common with jazz than it did with festival music. Oguchi himself says that whenever or said in books and interviews, he arranged music in a way similar to a jazz ensemble rather than a festival ensemble. So he took this foundation, he created something that took drums that had very long, old history and put them in new musical context for something that was a little more appealing to a modern audience, and made that the center of a performance. And that was the beginning of what we'll call contemporary taiko performance. Oguchi Sensei unfortunately died 2010, 2011. I'd have to find exactly the date. I want to say 2011 of a car accident, but his legacy, I mean, anybody who's playing traditional, like playing taiko nowadays that is not playing in festival ensemble, that's playing the taiko group, pretty much owes everything, almost everything, to Oguchi Daihachi. So this is one style. This is, again, has some connections, but not a whole lot. But it's not the only style to emerge. We also have a group that developed in the late 60s called, oh, it was 2008, was that earlier? You're right, I'm sorry, it was 2008 because in 2009 I attended a musical performance in his honor. I'm getting some dates mixed too. Thank you very much, Dr. Prescott. So we have Oguchi Daihachi and Osuwa Daiko becoming more and more famous throughout the late 50s and the early 60s and even into the late 60s. But then in the late 60s, we have in Tokyo the emergence of a group called Skeroku Taiko. And this is a picture from 1968, 1969. This group spearheaded a slightly different development of taiko performance than Oguchi Daihachi, where Oguchi Daihachi was taking a bunch of jazz influences and kind of sort of fusing it with Kagura Daiko and Matsuri Bayashi. Skeroku Taiko was very much based on Bon Daiko. That is the drumming that takes place during Obon, a Buddhist festival that happens in late July, early August. This year, for example, I believe it's August 12th, 13th, 14th, or somewhere around there. When it's believed that the barriers between this world and the next break down, and thus one's ancestors return to this realm. What you do during Obon is you go to the graves of your family, of your ancestors, you clean it up, you leave an offering, and then at night there's a celebration. And the celebration kind of looks like this. Have circle dances is one of the main elements of the evening celebrations. It's a type of dance called bonodori, where you dance in a circle with the combination of hand movements and feet movements in time to around a yagura or a tower. Or at the top of the yagura will be a taiko. Historically, there was a full music ensemble up there, but in the modern era, it's typical just a taiko playing to accompany music. Again, with the historical connections between taiko and the gods, it's very difficult to eliminate taiko from the context, but you can eliminate all the other instruments as well. It's very repetitive drumming because it is accompanying the melody itself and trying to just provide a beat to dance to. For example, at the foundation, you may hear, say, this is just two rhythms that you will hear quite often in bondaiko performance. The song that was performed before, I could probably accompany it entirely using that rhythm. And because you're on a yagara on top of this large tower, you don't have a whole lot of room to perform. However, this is where Tsugaryoko Taiko comes in. In the early 60s, you started to have competitions of bondaiko playing to find who the best bondaiko player would be. They all started competing, and with competition becomes the need to stand out. This involves partially rhythmic changes, but more than that, visual changes, broader, bigger motions, more choreographed motions that look good, that have no real musical purpose, although the music and the choreography starts to become linked. But more than anything, it becomes a competition. In the late 60s, these bondaiko champions, there was a group of bondaiko champions that started to emerge across Tokyo, came together and they answered a call for a bunch of drummers to start playing in a cabaret in the Ginza part of Tokyo. It was an idea that was concocted by a dancer who had gone to Brazil and saw samba and samba drumming at the Copacabana and other places in Brazil, and wanted to do something similar with Japanese music in Japan in the late 60s. So what happened is the members of Tsugaryoko Taiko got together and started thinking, how could they arrange their music for cabaret? And they looked to bondaiko as one of the major influences. So they took those rhythms that they were playing and started to say, okay, what can we do? How can we evolve this into a piece? They took some of the most commonly used rhythms in bondaiko and arranged them into a small, short melody. But that's kind of boring just to see in and of itself. It's not very visually appealing. You're at a cabaret. People are going to be paying money to see you. So what do? You add on some of the visual flares that you had developed on the yagara. What happens if you take the drum out of the yagara? Suddenly you have a little more room. Suddenly you can be a little more creative. That's still the basic rhythm, but visually it's very different now. And the question is, what is the significance of the stance? Is it for balance? Partially yes, partially that's just the stance that was developed by the Tsugaryoko Taiko players because it looked good. If you go across Tokyo, you'll find maybe these basic rhythms, but how they're standing behind the drums very much depends. The stance that I use is, even different Tsugaryoko players have different styles. This is one particular type of stance. So it's for looks as much as anything else, as much as this was. Because they are playing in cabarets, they have to look good. So they take this foundation and they say, okay, what do? They created a piece called Midare Uchi, or dirty hitting. And they took the foundation of bondaiko, but made it into something else. And this is Midare Uchi as performed by the students of the original Tsugaryoko Taiko members, and the soloist that is actually coming up is the son of one of the Tsugaryoko Taiko members. So it's that same bondaiko rhythm, but visually not very different. Midariuchi is just a series of improvised bondaiko solos. Is it traditional? Not necessarily. Is it new? Not necessarily. Because it uses elements of both. That's why at the very beginning, I was kind of talking about how it's not an old versus new, because especially in contemporary taiko performance, what you're finding is a lot of complex combinations of elements. Ishizuka Yu, the person who's playing this solo, for example, has intense training in Hogaku Hayashi, because his father, one of the founders of Tsukeroku Taiko, is Mochizuki Saburo. Mochizuki Saburo is his stage name because he received a notori in Hogaku Hayashi and became a Hogaku Hayashi performer. So a lot of people who are trained in this Tsukeroku style have training in Hogaku music as well. So they're starting to bring in all these different elements. So it's this combination of traditional and modern music, this hybrid thing that is for the enjoyment of an audience. And that gets even deeper with a group called Ondekoza. Ondekoza is the third group I'm talking about as we're starting to wrap things up. They were founded in 1970 by an individual who wanted to use taiko as a way to revitalize traditional performing arts in Japan. He brought a group of like-minded individuals to live on the island of Sado, which is off to the west coast of Japan in Niigata Prefecture. And they trained intensely in regional performance styles from across Japan, which they then took and rearranged for stage performance. They dedicated themselves in every way, shape, and form, where they would run practically a marathon every day, 10 to 20 kilometers, perform for play for 8 hours a day in between, maybe doing 5K and 5K or 10K and 10K. They made their debut in 1976 in the United States, making headlines by running the Boston Marathon and then playing taiko at the end of the Boston Marathon, and the group did not stop until all their players had finished running. So they were very much about showing the Japanese male body and the power of taiko and of the Japanese male body. But at the same time, they were also arranging festival music. For example, a piece called Yatai Bayashi is based on Chichibu Yatai Bayashi, the music of the Chichibu Yomatsuri, the Chichibu Night Festival that happens on the first Saturday in December. They went and traveled and took audio recordings and transcribed the festival music, brought it back to Sado, asked her from performers from Chichibu to come to Sado and teach them, and then they arranged it for the concert stage. What they're playing has a lot in common with the festival music, but is not the festival music. The rhythms are the same sort of kind of as they are in the festival. They actually straightened a bit of a lilt that exists in the original festival because they found they could not reproduce it the way it happens in Chichibu. The rhythms are semi-improvised in Chichibu. What they did is took a lot of these semi-improvised rhythms and arranged it into a single thing that was played along 3 different performers. While a Chudaiko, a Nagaro Daiko, Byouchi Daiko is performed. The way that they are hitting the drum has significance because it's based on how it's played in Chichibu, where this music is performed on much smaller drums inside a large yatai, a large yatai, what would be the English translation of it? Cart. Yeah, large cart, as in multiple story cart, that is carried around the streets of Chichibu. And as that cart is being pulled, they would perform this music. Onde Koza sped it up, codified the sami improvised rhythms into a set rhythmic melody, and performed it on stage. The question came is, what would typical man on the street in Japan think that these styles are traditional Japanese and a source of national pride? Those are two different questions. Would they believe that is traditional Japanese music? Complicated. Because they can go see traditional Japanese music. It's taiko. It's just another way of playing taiko. Because they could go see chichibu. Do people outside of Japan think this is traditional Japanese music? Probably more than you would think. Say yes, because it's been sold that way. What they are saying is traditional Japanese music because it happens to be based on festival rhythms, and these are old drums and so forth. The source of national pride is another interesting question because taiko have very much been at the forefront of Japanese promotion of Japanese culture. I'm going to get into that a little more actually in just a second. So I'm going to put that source of national pride part for a moment. I've stopped on this image for a moment because we have to talk about one of the major images of people playing taiko that is wearing a fundoshi. This has no basis in origin and tradition at all in Japan. This is all Pierre Cardin's fault. And that's not a joke. This is Pierre Cardin's fault. Onde Koza played a gig in the mid-70s at the Danjiri Matsuri where a lot of the festival performers are wearing loincloths. But taiko is not traditionally played in loincloths. But whenever Onde Koza was playing a show in Paris, they were not getting great attendance. They were trying to figure out ways to boost sales. So Pierre Cardin, who owned the theater they were playing at, said, I saw a picture of you guys playing at this one festival in loincloths. Why don't you come out during this one song where you hit on a big drum called odaiko, and instead of wearing your normal performance gear, why don't you wear loincloths? And then traditionally in the Onde Koza concert repertoire, it would go straight from Onde Koza, it would go from odaiko to yatai bayashi, so they'd be wearing fundoshi in both pieces. That's it. That's the only reason why they do it, and then it became well known. But nevertheless, Onde Koza toured around the world and started to increase awareness around the world of taiko performance. This hybrid thing that is using a combination of old music that is being arranged for new ways, or they started composing original pieces for themselves as well. And one of the main people that was playing this is Eiichi. I've gone a little longer beyond the normal Q&A question portion, presentation performance, because I've been answering questions right now. So I'm going to end with Eiichi. I just wanted, this actually talks about the national source of national pride. Eiichi was a person who was a majority of the arrangements for Onde Koza. He became the first professional taiko soloist in 1982, and he has been designated as a cultural ambassador by Japan. So with Japanese cultural ambassadorial events, like he'll travel to Qatar or the UAE as a representative of Japanese culture. So taiko has very much become synonymous with a lot of efforts of, this is something of Japanese national pride, something that they can use because it's very approachable. It's drumming. It is something that anybody can do. You just hit a drum. He's also actually maybe by coincidence, he's the group that started, he's the individual who started Dublin Taiko, the group that I'm the assistant director of. But he has worked very hard to help promote Japanese culture through taiko performance, but he's performing new original compositions, but using old drums. So the barrier of tradition and modern becomes blurred. So we're seeing this tradition as a basis for innovation, where we're seeing all of these old performance styles being mitigated through different styles and put on stage. So you may find Kagura music performed alongside Matsuri Bayashi, performed beside maybe something from Hogaku Hayashi, performed beside a 21st century composition, all on one stage by a taiko group. And it becomes a very complicated question about whether this is modern or not, because the question then becomes, how do you define what modernity is and such. So with that, I'm going to end the presentation side. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I'm immediately seeing a question. Artist traditionalists have been outraged. They appreciate the attention that Taiko is getting. It goes both ways. Some like the focus that Taiko is getting, and maybe it's placing emphasis upon older styles of music and maybe resulting in some individuals then starting to study this type of music. But then the flip side of it is that some people may think that the original is traditional, so they want to study that and not the original. So it's a very complicated negotiation between the two. Do you have any other questions? About anything I maybe didn't cover, but you're interested in, because I'm pretty an open book and willing to answer anything.
Devin Tipp, one of our previous presenters, has a question he would like to ask. Devin, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okie dokie, I am unmuted. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Pachter. I really enjoyed your presentation, hearing about Taiko and stuff. It's an instrumental media I'm not necessarily familiar with. I have two sort of specific questions in that. Could you talk a little bit more about how Taiko music is organized rhythmically? Is it a colotonic music like in Gagaku or in some, is all of the music in sort of a duple or 4/4 kind of feeling meter, or does it change depending on what kind of Taiko music is being performed?
The answer to all those questions is yes. As in, it's kind of everything. It really very much depends on the type of music you're looking at. For example, some festival music is a lot more structured in, and if I would be transcribing it, it's very easy to do in 4/4 time. Mm-hmm. But Yatai Bayashi, for example, is not. Whenever I had to transcribe it for my dissertation, it's a combination of 5/4, 10/8, 4/4, 3, based on the organization, because it's not thought of in that fashion. Because it's semi-improvisational, it's based on kind of segments. But then you'll have Edo Bayashi, which is pretty strictly, it's groups of 8. So you could divide it into a 4/4 if you want to think of it that way. But what becomes problematic is there's not a sense of a whole note or a half note or a quarter note. Dawn has no rhythmic meaning.
Right.
Dawn is a hit.
Right.
Even if I say Dawn Doko Dawn, that could be quarter, eighth, quarter, or eighth, 16/16, or a very, very fast whole, half, whole.
Indeed.
So, and that just kind of goes around the board where it's all the things and none of the things all at once.
I see.
Contemporary compositions tend to hold within the realm of standard Western music. So you'll see 4/4 or 12/8 or 3/4, things that could be easily transcribed, but that's, I would bet, in part the result of people who grew up in a Western musical tradition, thus trying to write music for Taiko, but they always have in the back of their head, always hearing a backbeat.
I see.
So 4/4.
Okay.
But then you have people who are not trained in those styles sometimes make a little more interesting music as a result.
Cool. Thank you.
Ben, there's 2 more questions on the chat that I thought you might deal with, and then at 7:30 we can let people go. But if you want to stay on a little bit longer,
totally.
Talk to anybody who wants to stay on. So,
so the first question is, how much of a physical workout is playing Taiko? It is very much a big physical workout. All the Pittsburgh Taiko people can attest. One of the reasons keep playing during quarantine is because if you don't do it, you will be hurting the first time you come back and play it again. The flip side is you have to be very careful and keep yourself in very good shape, because if you hurt yourself, you can't play. I'm actually in the midst of that portion right now, where I was practicing throughout quarantine, and then I screwed up my rotator cuff slightly. I pulled something, so I've not been able to practice for a few weeks. Do you play like a marathon or in short burst? Yes, both. Marathon is, it's a cardiovascular workout. So you have to be able to play on Odaiko, for example. That's a very short, heavy workout, but you also have to be able to do it over a long period of time. So it's all about a cardiovascular workout in the end. That's why Ondakoza was running 10 kilometers every day. Are there any Taiko standards that everyone who plays Taiko is expected to know? In the United States, they're not expected to know, but there's certain pieces that everyone does kind of know because everyone can probably trace their performance lineage to 1 or 3 or 4 different groups. So because in the end, it kind of combines, most people would know certain pieces, but the version that they may know may be slightly different than another. Bon Daiko is also known as Matsuri Daiko in the United States, but 2 people may not know the same version of Matsuri Daiko. There may be a 5-line melody version versus a 4-line melody version versus a 6-line melody version. So it combines across the board. And then Micho-san asked about the song of Bon Daiko is mostly just don, don, ga, don, takata, da. It just thought as it's how in Kyoto and Gion Matsuri, how is Taiko played? Kon Chikikin, the sound of bell is heard more Taiko. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, something that I've been thinking about looking at more and more, because I've read some people who say that the origin of most modern festival music is Gion Matsuri, and everything kind of derived from that. To speak to your first point about what the sound of Bon Daiko in Tokyo sounds like, yes, it's definitely more swung than what I played. I greatly simplified it because even then it's not always in 4/4 and it's very complicated because we're talking about regional differences. Bon Daiko is not played the same way in different parts of Japan. And then whenever it came over here, how do you talk about the history and so forth and so forth. So I can't speak to how Taiko is played in Gion, but you're right that probably the sound of the bell is more prevalent than Taiko, but Taiko is still there. And thank you, Aaron and Jake, for answering the question about a solid piece drum. Yes, that was a single large tree trunk that gets smaller and smaller with smaller drums. The modern Taiko music reminds me of Polynesian music. Was the first gentleman who rewrote classical music influenced with Polynesian music or vice versa? That's a very interesting question. Oguchi-san played in a Hawaiian band. So he probably had some influence there, but he also says that he was very much influenced by jazz. So it could be in the back of the head, he had some Polynesian sounds and rhythms in his head, but he states that it was jazz influenced and he was just kind of taking a swing beat. Because if you think the rhythm is like dut, 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 it's a swing beat on a cymbal. Sing, dun, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So there's some commonality, but it could be a little more complicated than that because of his own musical background. So at this point, I know we've reached 7:30, so I don't know if you want to officially wrap it up, and I'm willing to stay here as long as people have questions as well.
Well, I just want to say thank you very, very much to Ben and all of Pittsburgh Taiko for coming in tonight and joining us